Hello friends, whenever we talk about Mughal India, the very name or the very word Mughal conjures up impressions of wonderful gardens, magnificent buildings, a glorious empire. But you see, all this could not have been sustained without a sound administrative system which lay at the foundation of the empire. But to understand the intricacies of this administrative system that the Mughals had crafted out, one of the most important and credible sources are the writings of AbulFazal. Okay? So let us begin by looking at Fazal. AbulFazal was the Grand Minister of the Mughal Emperor Akbar and the author of two very important works, Akbarnama and Aini-Akbari. Although the third volume of the Akbarnama is the Aini-Akbari, and he is also credited with a Persian translation of the Bible. He was also one of the 9 gems of Akbar's royal court and the brother of Faizi, who was the poet laureate of Emperor Akbar. But before we get further into the discussion, two anterior clarifications are important. First, immense as the influence of AbulFazal might have been on Akbar's political philosophy and policy, it would be prudent not to indulge in any exaggeration of it. Akbar himself was a man of genius, and there were several other factors that gave shape to his concepts of government and administration. Among these forces, AbulFazal's influence was one, no doubt a very important one, but certainly not the only factor. And the other important clarification is that one must take into consideration the whole character of the Mughal polity as it functioned at the time of AbulFazal, for this was the milieu in which AbulFazal lived, worked and basked. So what about the Mughal state? The basic characteristics of the Mughal state were twofold. First, it was essentially a military regime, and second, it was a highly centralized despotism with the emperor as the fountainhead of all power and authority. For the Muslim subjects of this regime, the Mughal emperor was the sovereign head of both the church and the state. Hence, the emperor engaged in a number of religious and social functions vis-a-vis the Muslim population. But with regard to the non-Muslim subjects, the emperor discharged only policy functions and collected revenue. The king also patronized art and culture, but this orientation was not pursued as a matter of regular or even any systematic policy. We find that consolidation of rule, of Mughal rule, happens at the hand of Akbar in no uncertain ways. It was Akbar who consolidated the Mughal administrative setup, giving it a structure of government and administration more or less along the lines of the Delhi Sultanate. A strong, well-planned administrative system is the key to good governance as well as welfare and prosperity and peace of the people, and guarantee of security against any invasion. Such a position of security and prosperity is hardly attainable without loyal and intelligent officers and an efficient army. The Mughal polity, however, please note, is not just a continuation of what you find in the Sultanate, for Akbar had introduced substantial alterations. Designations of office bearers had been changed, and a provincial administration crafted along the lines of the central administrative system had been put in place. Elaborate rules and regulations had been drafted for ensuring better control. So what about the administrative system? First, it had a pan-Indian character. Babur and Humayun, for reasons of their brief reign and their preoccupation with military matters, could not concentrate on establishing a definite system or pattern of administration. By the end of Akbar's regime, we find establishment of elaborate offices with clearly assigned functions to the heads of offices. As in the Arthashastra of Kautilya, the state was divided into different levels, and each level was entrusted to various officials performing different functions. All were responsible for the administration of the state, but given the extremely centralized nature of the realm, all were ultimately responsible and accountable to the one and only emperor. And the emperor, therefore, was the pivot of the administration, the Shahanshah, as the saying goes. The ancient traditions of India had always supported a strong ruler. The Muslim jurists and writers also echoed that view. Thus, the concept of divine origin of monarchy could easily find credence amongst the Indian people who looked upon the emperor as God's shadow on earth. It is therefore not surprising that the Mughals publicized their Jharoka Darshan with such pomp and show, in which the emperor appeared at an appointed hour before the general public, the myth being that a mere look at His Majesty would redress their grievances. With such popular perception, perhaps adulation of the ruler, it is obvious that all offices in the Mughal administration owed their position and power to the emperor. Their appointment, promotion, demotion, termination were all subject to the ruler's personal choices, preferences, and whims. So there were literally no checks on the emperor. We have seen that earlier also, that if there was any check at all, it was only a moral imperative. And enjoying this absolute power, the emperor was never subject to any political check. A number of officers in the different governmental departments were appointed for smooth functioning of transactions involving various affairs. In Mughal administration, the Vakil was theoretically the head of the administration, and in the early years of Akbar's reign, this post was occupied by Bairam Khan, who served as the regent. Akbar, subsequently on attaining power, divided the duties of the Vakil among the number of people, with the result that the office became more ornamental than otherwise. More often than not, it was not filled, and even when it was, the noble who occupied it had to perform supervisory rather than real executive functions. And there were major departments of administration. You have the Diwan, who is also called the Wazir or the Chief Minister, who held the primary position among them and looked after revenue and finance, but kept an overview over all matters of expenditure and related departments, recording all imperial orders and assigning duties and expenses to officers at the district level like the Faujdars. His primary duty, of course, was to, which is why he was such an important position, it was to supervise the imperial treasury and check all accounts. He personally inspected all transactions and payments in all departments. He maintained direct contact with the provincial diwans, and their functioning was put under his vigil. And his seal and signatures were necessary for the validation of all official papers involving revenue. The Diwan, of course, had independent authority, although in rank he may have been subordinated to the Vakil, and he was responsible for appointing revenue officials at the Pargana level, subject to, of course, royal approval. There were other departments in addition to the Diwan. The Mir Bakshi, for instance, handled the military pay and accounts and all related duties. He not only was the paymaster for all officers, but also played an important role in recruitment of soldiers, listing of mansabdars, and the important officials. The Mir Bakshi played the same role as the Ariz of the Sultanate. Another important official was the Khani Saman or the Mir Saman. He dealt with matters relating to maintaining record and requirement of the state karkhanas, stores, orders, interactions and international relations, as well as all internal matters. He had to maintain a list of the articles produced in the karkhanas, the presents given to the emperor, especially those by ambassadors from foreign countries, and that is where his international role also crept in. The precious stones in the treasuries and the statements about income from the royal gardens were all under his sway. The Sadr was the head of the religious donations and contributions. He also looked after the education and imperial arms. The Sadr acted as the chief Qazi before Shah Jahan, but Aurangzeb divided these two offices and allotted two separate persons for these posts. The chief Qazi was the Qazi ul Qazzat. He was the head of the judiciary, and his principal duty was to administer the Shariat law both in civil and criminal cases. In the capacity of the chief Qazi, he looked into the appointment of the Qazis at subsequent provincial levels right down the hierarchy. What is the Waqa'i-Navis? This is also an interesting element of the system of Mughal administration. Every department had its own complement of clerks who were responsible for putting on paper all the transactions of each department. The older system of Waqa'i-Navis, both at the center and in the provinces, was continued, and 14 such writers were present at court, with 2 of them on duty in rotation and all times. And this is why you have references to the Mughal administration as paper government. A written record of the day's activities was presented to the emperor the next day for his approval. What you find unmistakably is a clear centralization of administration. Akbar was keen to ensure that the entire administration was centralized and systematized, and the empire was divided into sarkars and mahals. He put in place a range of ministers at different levels who were controlled by ministers at the center. The entire system was based on secular principles. For religion of the office bearers, and this is an important facet of Akbar's liberalism, the religion of the office bearers did not in any way interfere with their administrative work. There was also the zamindars or the jagirdars, who were small landlords under the king, and they often maintained forces which were used by the emperor to contain or combat chieftains. There was also a class of bhumiya who got some land from the jagirdars. They were owners of the land, but they did not pay any duty for it, probably because the land was inferior in quality to that of the jagirdars. And there was also the Khalsal in the vicinity of the capital, which was under the direct control of the emperor. We find that the Mughal emperors did not disturb this system which prevailed from the days of the Sultanate. One of the very important facets of the Mughal administrative system was the Mansabdari system. The Mughal state was based on this system, which was basically borrowed from Persia. Mansab apparently meant rank or position. By itself, it was not an office, being more an indication of place in the hierarchy of the nobility. When Akbar put this system into practice, the Mansab ranks consisted of 2 parts expressed in numeric terms and known as Zat and Sawar, where the first indicated the personal rank of the noble and the rights, and the latter the number of troops, usually a force of horses, that he had to maintain. They collected revenue on behalf of the ruler and received salary in cash. It created a military hierarchy in the Mughal state, which was basically like a status symbol. All Mansabdars were selected after a fairly long drawn process. There was also the Jagirdari system that needs to be mentioned. Under the reign of Akbar, land was divided into 2 categories, Khalisa and Jagir. Land revenue of the Khalisa was directly for the royal treasury, and Jagirs were allocated to the Jagirdars according to their rank. Mansabdars receiving cash payment were known as Naqdi. The Jagirs were the assignment of revenue given to the Mansabdars, and the assignees were Jagirdars. This was similar to the Ikta system that prevailed in the time of the Sultanate. There were 4 types of Jagirs: Jagir Tankha, Mashrut Jagir, Inam Jagir, and Watan Jagir. The revenue department maintained a record, Jama Dami, that indicated the assessment income Jama of various areas, indicated in dams calculated as 40 dams to a rupee. The Jagirs were transferable, and no Jagirdar was given the same Jagir for a long time. We come to another aspect, military administration. The Mughal emperor was not only an administrator, but a great general, in order to retain all power in his hands. Akbar had a strong army which was maintained by Mansabdars. While AbulFazal was a believer in hierarchy, he was also concerned about the need for talent irrespective of social background. Akbar was also sensitive to this aspect that was highlighted by Fazal. What were the main constituents of the army? You have cavalry, infantry, war elephants, artillery, and navy as the major units that constituted the army. The land revenue policy of Akbar is also important to consider. He divided all provinces into sarkars and parganas. Each sarkar was divided into a number of parganas. There was a Shikdar and Amil for the collection of revenue and their posts of treasurer, Kanungo, etc. A large number of people were entrusted with looking after the production at the time of harvest and the state's share in it. Dashala, or a 10-year system, was the basis of Akbar's revenue policy. The productivity and local prices during the last 10 years were arranged in cash on the basis of information. Land revenue was the heaviest demand on the peasants. The farmers were exploited by collecting authorities like the landlords, who did not spare them even during natural calamities like famines, and that was often in violation of the emperor's directive. Akbar took note of this fact and ultimately took preventive measures against such exploitation of farmers, but the system did not get cleansed entirely. Provincial administration is yet another hallmark of the Mughal administrative system. The Mughal Empire was divided into provinces like subas, and these were further subdivided into sarkars. Below the sarkars came mahals or parganas, and these in turn consisted of mauzas or dehes or villages. In Mughal times, please note, a mauza meant not only the houses in a village, but also the land around it that was cultivated by the villagers. The mauza was not necessarily a single village alone. A number of villages called nagla could be included in it. About the functioning of the provincial administration, we can take note of certain important features. Provincial administration was designed much along the same lines as at the center. So, each suba had its own diwan, its bakshi, its mir adal, its sadar, its qazi, kotwal, and all other functionaries and office bearers. If the provinces had rivers or were situated along the coast, then another official, an additional one called Mir Bahar, was appointed for the maintenance of river and sea transport and the ports management as well. It was his responsibility to supervise not only river transport but also to keep ferries and docks in good condition. Ports were additionally allotted an official, Shah Bandar, who was the official meant to look after the collection of custom duties and all other activities related to the port and its functioning. The provincial administration was engineered to ensure maintenance of law and order. Sarkar was placed under Faujdars, who were primarily responsible for the maintenance of law and order. As in the times of the Delhi Sultanate, so also in Mughal times, the Pargana was that part of the province on which the main thrust of revenue collection duties actually devolved. Under the Mughals, the head of the Pargana administration was the Amil. He was originally in charge of both assessment and collection of revenue, but you see that from the time of, and these emperors were always making changes to suit changing times and requirements. So from the time of Shah Jahan, we find an official called the Amin, who was placed in charge of assessment. Where the Amin was also given charge of police duties, he was called the Faujdar. He was given the responsibility for creating conditions of peace and security for the areas under his charge and responsibility. But despite this elaborate scheme of provincial administration that we see in Mughal India, let us not lose sight of the fact that there was always very clear, proper centralization in place, because the Mughal emperor was the linchpin of the entire system, and he wanted to hold the strings of all the departments in his hands. It is evident that Akbar set the firm base for the provincial administration by fixing the territories of the provincial units and establishing a uniform administrative model subject to minor alterations in keeping with local circumstances. So each province had a set of officials representing the branches of state activity, which made control over the provinces more effective. What about local administration? At the village level, the subas were divided into sarkars, which were further subdivided into parganas. The Faujdar, we have already mentioned, was the chief executive head of a sarkar, and he was responsible for maintaining law and order within his jurisdiction, and he executed the royal decrees and regulations. He also kept the powerful zamindars under check. Amal Guzar, or the revenue collector, was the next important officer so far as local administration is concerned. The Shikdar maintained the general administration and law and order of the parganas, assisted by the Amil, who was the revenue collector, the Amin, who was the assessor of revenue, the Patadar, who was the treasurer, the Kanungo, who was the keeper of the land record, and Bitikchis, who were the clerks. The village head, or the Mukaddam, Sarpanch, in other words, dealt with functions locally. The Patwari assisted him by taking care of village revenue records. So we find that in Mughal India there was an elaborate scheme of administration and governance, and it is because of this sound system of administration that had been put into place by the wisdom of a retinue of administrators and thinking bureaucrats who were all assisting the king in ensuring one clear goal, and that was to maintain the welfare of the people while ensuring the security and stability and the political order of the realm. So we find in conclusion that the Mughal government was a highly centralized absolutism, and the emperor was its pivot. He had to carry out a large amount of correspondence. Hence, the Mughal administration was a Kagzi Raj, something I have alluded to earlier, paper government. But that is not to be understood in a negative sense. It shows the meticulous eye for detail over each and every fragment of the empire about which the Mughal emperor wanted to keep himself abreast. But that is why it needs to be clarified that the intricate scheme of governance was not merely by kalami or by pen, it was also by saifi or the sword. It is only through this kind of a very balanced operation of both mercy and punishment that peace and order was available to people inhabiting the wide contours of the Mughal Empire.